She was 22 years old, and the only things she owned outright were a wood-handled draw knife, worn smooth by another woman's grip, and the $40 she had earned picking rocks out of frozen ground for a farmer who paid her in coins because he didn't trust paper. $40. That was the sum of Maeve Colquhoun's life on the morning she walked out of her stepfather's house in the settlement of Heron Crossing, British Columbia, with nothing behind her but a slammed door and the sound of her stepsister's laughter cutting through the cold November air. She didn't look back. She had learned, long before that morning, that looking back only gave cruel people the satisfaction of seeing your face. She had been born in Prince Edward Island, red clay and salt wind, a childhood she remembered more in textures than images. The feel of her mother's braid between her fingers, the scratch of a wool blanket, the particular way the cold came off the Northumberland Strait in October, through the walls and under the doors and into your very blood. Her mother had died when Maeve was 7, of a sickness that came on fast and left even faster, and her father had remarried within the year, the way grieving men sometimes did, not out of cruelty but out of a terror of silence and empty rooms. The new wife was from away, people said, as though that explained everything, and perhaps it did. They moved west. When Maeve was 9, her father chasing work on the rail lines that were still threading their way through the mountains. He died in an accident near Hope when Maeve was 11. A cable snapping, a thing that shouldn't have happened. And after that, Maeve's life in her stepmother's house became a matter of endurance. She learned to wake before anyone else, to make herself useful before she could be called useless, to disappear into the corners of rooms when arguments started. The one bright thing was Sylvia Oak. Sylvia Oak was a woodcarver who lived at the end of the river road, 2 miles from the Colquhoun property. She was a widow in her late 60s, short and deliberate in her movements, with hands that looked like the roots of old trees, and eyes that were permanently crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of squinting at fine grain. She had no children. What she had, instead, was a shop full of tools and the patience of someone who had decided long ago that patience was the only currency worth accumulating. Maeve had wandered to her door at 13, drawn by the smell of fresh cedar shavings and the sound of something she couldn't name at the time. The sound of concentrated work, of someone fully present in what they were doing. Sylvia had looked at her for a moment and then simply said, "Come in, and don't touch anything until I tell you to." She taught her everything, not all at once, and not easily, but thoroughly. She taught her to read the grain of wood before she put a blade to it, the way a careful person reads the mood of a room before they speak. She taught her the difference between working with the wood and fighting it. She taught her that a chair leg tapered right will last 100 years, and a chair leg tapered wrong will give out in 10, and that there's a quiet kind of pride in making something that will outlive you. She made Maeve a draw knife with a white oak handle, fitted exactly to the reach of her hands. The blade she had forged herself, the edge balanced, the pull smooth and true. It was the first thing anyone had ever made specifically for her, and Maeve carried it with her the way other girls carried mementos. Not as ornament, but as proof. When Sylvia died in the early spring, 2 years before that November morning, she left Maeve the shop, the tools, and the little woodlot behind the property. She left it in a will written in her careful, even hand, witnessed by 2 women from the Methodist Church. It was legal. It was hers. But Maeve's stepmother, Gertrude Colquhoun, saw something different when she looked at that will. She saw a young woman with no money, no standing, and no way to fight. She saw an opportunity. The dispute came through a solicitor, a small, dry-mouthed man named Roland Fitch, who drove out from the town of Lachlan 3 times over the course of a month, each time with a new document and a new set of figures. He was always apologetic, in the way that people are apologetic when they have decided to do something, but prefer not to feel responsible for it. He would stand in the doorway of Sylvia's shop, Maeve's shop, she told herself, say it plainly, and explain, without meeting her eyes, that there were debts, that Sylvia Oak had owed money to the Colquhoun household for years of small loans, goods provided, services rendered. The figures were in a ledger Gertrude had produced, the handwriting suspiciously neat for records that were supposedly kept informally across more than a decade. The total was a number Maeve could never repay. The offer was this: sign over the deed to the property in the woodlot, and the debts would be considered settled. She would have 30 days to vacate. Maeve read the documents twice. She did not cry. She had spent 11 years learning not to perform her feelings for Gertrude Colquhoun, and she was not about to start now. She simply folded the papers, handed them back, and said she needed time to think. She spent 3 days. She went over Sylvia's actual records, the real ones, kept in a biscuit tin under the workbench. There was nothing. No loans, no debts, no trace of any transaction with the Colquhoun household. Sylvia had been meticulous. What Gertrude had produced was fiction, dressed in plausible ink. On the fourth day, she went back to Roland Fitch and told him she would not sign. He was not surprised, exactly, but he was uncomfortable. He said there would be a hearing. She said she understood. He drove back to Lachlan. And 2 weeks later, Gertrude had found a second solicitor and a judge who owed her husband's family a favor. And the hearing went the way hearings go when one party has money and connections, and the other has only the truth. The deed went to Gertrude. The woodlot went to Gertrude. The shop went to Gertrude. The tools, however, were not on the deed. Maeve had read the document carefully. She packed what she could carry. Her draw knife wrapped in wool cloth, 3 good chisels, a marking gauge, Sylvia's wooden mallet, a change of clothes, a small bag of oatmeal, a block of hard cheese, and the $40 she had saved from the rock-picking work. She packed quietly, in the early morning, before anyone in the Colquhoun house was awake. She left the door of the shop unlocked, because it wasn't hers to lock anymore, and she walked out into the cold gray of a November dawn. She walked north, away from Heron Crossing, along the old logging road that ran parallel to the Kettle River. The trees pressed close on both sides, the spruce and fir heavy with the particular silence of late autumn, the ground frozen hard enough to ring under her boots. She was not afraid, exactly. She had been afraid for so long that it had changed into something else, something flatter and more functional. She was cold. She was tired. She was paying attention. The logging road wound down through a steep cutbank 2 miles north of town, where the river bent hard to the east, and the bank on the far side was a wall of exposed rock streaked with frost. It was in this bend that she found it. The sawmill was not truly abandoned. It had simply been left. There is a difference. An abandoned thing has been given up on. This one felt more as though its owner had stepped out for a moment 20 years ago and had not yet come back. The main building was a low, wide structure of squared timber, the roof mostly intact but sagging in one corner, where a rafter had given way. The great circular saw blade still hung in its housing, seized with rust but solid. The mill race was silted over, but the stone weir that fed it was still sound. The timber frame was old-growth Douglas fir, the kind that doesn't rot easily and doesn't forget its strength. There was a sign above the door, the letters faded nearly to nothing. Oak & Sons Lumber, Est 1887. Maeve stood in the thin November light and read that sign for a long time. Oak. Sylvia Oak's husband had been a miller. She had mentioned it once, almost in passing, the way you mention the most important things briefly, as though they're too large for long sentences. He had died young. The mill had closed. She had sold what she could, and moved to the river road, and taken up her carving tools and made a different life. What she had not mentioned, what perhaps she had not known, was what was still inside. Maeve pushed open the heavy plank door. The smell hit her first. Old sawdust and cold iron and something else, dry and faintly sweet, the smell of cured wood stored out of the weather. Her eyes adjusted. The main floor held the saw housing, a long conveyor carriage, and the detritus of a mill's working life. Belts and pulleys, iron fittings, oil cans long since dried to a residue. But along the back wall, behind a low partition she had dug under, she found the storeroom. It was stacked, floor to ceiling, with lumber, not rough-cut timber, dressed lumber, planks that had been planed and stacked and stickered with thin spacing boards to let them breathe, the way a person who intended to come back would stack them. White oak, quarter sawn, the grain straight and close and beautiful, the kind of cut that was already rare by the turn of the century, and nearly impossible to find by the time Maeve pushed open that door. She ran her hand along the face of the nearest board and felt the cool, dense smoothness of wood that had been drying quietly for 2 decades. There were at least 300 board feet, maybe more. She stood very still in that cold storeroom for a long moment. She was a woodcarver without a workshop, standing inside a mill that had been left to her teacher's family name, staring at enough seasoned material to build furniture for a lifetime. She did not allow herself to feel hope right away. Hope, she had learned, was something you had to earn by working first. But she allowed herself to think clearly. She spent 3 days assessing the building and its contents. She slept in the storeroom under her coat, and a horse blanket she found on a hook by the door, ate oatmeal, cooked over a small fire in the mill's stone hearth, and went over every inch of the structure the way Sylvia had taught her to go over a piece of wood, without assumptions, following what was actually there, rather than what she expected to find. The roof needed attention in one corner. The mill race would need clearing. if she ever wanted to run water through again. But she didn't need that now. The saw housing was seized but not broken. The floor was solid. The timber frame was magnificent. She walked into Lachlan on the 4th day. She went to the land registry office, a narrow room above the hardware store that smelled of mildew and old paper, and asked to see the record for the Kettle River sawmill on the Heron Crossing North Road. The clerk, a tired-looking young man with ink-stained cuffs, found it after some searching. The property had not been sold. It had been left in the estate of one Thomas Oak, deceased 1901, and the estate had never been fully settled. There were no outstanding liens. There were no claimants on record. The property existed in a kind of administrative limbo, unresolved, unclaimed, and technically still part of an estate that had never been closed. She asked what it would take to establish a legitimate claim. He looked at her carefully, as though he wasn't entirely sure she was serious. She met his eyes and waited. He pulled out a different ledger and began to explain. It took 3 weeks and cost her 30 of her $40. Filing fees, a small retainer for a solicitor in Lachlan named Evangeline Ross, who took the case because she found it interesting and because she had known Sylvia Oak and had her own opinions about Gertrude Colquhoun. The process was not complicated legally. An unclaimed estate, a clear absence of competing claimants, and an applicant with a demonstrable connection to the deceased's family name through her teacher's documented will. The one that Gertrude had managed to circumvent on the property, but which still existed as a record of Sylvia's intentions. Evangeline Ross filed the paperwork with quiet efficiency and a certain professional satisfaction. Meanwhile, Maeve worked. She had $10 left, enough for basic provisions but not much else. She set up her tools in the storeroom, using a sawhorse made from mill scraps as a workbench. She was not trying to produce anything to sell yet. She was practicing economy of movement, working through Sylvia's lessons the way a musician runs scales, keeping her hands honest and her eye accurate. She carved small things. A wooden bowl from a scrap of white oak, a ladle, a set of pegs, practical objects, made precisely. The cold was the main problem. She kept a fire going in the hearth, salvaged more wood from the mill's considerable stores of scrap, and slept close to the coals at night. She was thinner than she should have been, and her hands were chapped and cracked from the cold and the work. She kept going. The first person to notice was a man named Crispin Forel, a farmer who ran cattle in the valley above the mill and came down the North Road twice a week with his team. He stopped one afternoon when he saw smoke from the mill chimney and came to the door with the wariness of someone who has found trespassers before and is prepared to deal with them calmly. What he found instead was a young woman with a draw knife and a pile of white oak shavings, finishing the inside curve of a wooden bowl with a care that made him stop in the doorway and watch for a moment before he spoke. He didn't say much. He asked if she needed anything. She said she could use a regular supply of firewood and she would pay in trade. He looked at the bowl. He said his wife had been after him for 2 years to find someone who could make a proper set of wooden spoons that wouldn't split at the handle. She handed him the ladle she had just finished. He turned it over in his hands for a while. He told her he'd send his boy down with a cord of birch in the morning. That was how it started. She did not advertise. She didn't have to. In a small settlement, a person with a specific and genuine skill becomes known the way a spring becomes known. Not by announcement, but by the fact that people who are thirsty find their way to it. A widow named Beatrice Sorn, from the east end of the valley, came to her with a rocking chair that had been her mother's, the seat split clean through, the joints loose. Maeve recut the seat from a piece of the white oak, fitted it without nails, glued and wedged the joints, and handed it back in a week. Beatrice Sorn ran her hand over the repair for a long time, and then said quietly that she could not tell where the new wood ended and the old began. Maeve told her that was the idea. A rancher brought her a broken axe handle. A logger brought her 3 tool handles that needed replacing. A woman from the Methodist church, the same church where Sylvia's will had been witnessed, came to ask if she could repair the cracked panel on a vestry cupboard. She could and did. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable exactly. But she was working, and she was eating, and she was beginning to be known in the valley by her name and her trade, rather than by her connection to Gertrude Colquhoun. That was worth more than comfort. She was 4 weeks into this new life when Evangeline Ross rode out from Lachlan with the news about Gertrude. Maeve was at her makeshift bench when she heard the horse on the road. She had learned in recent weeks to pay attention to sounds, the difference between a rider passing through and one who was slowing down, the difference between footsteps that were certain and footsteps that were deciding, These were things Sylvia had never needed to teach her. Life had. Evangeline Ross was a compact woman in her 40s, with a no-nonsense manner that Maeve had come to appreciate. She dismounted, tied her horse to the mill's old hitching post, still solid, and came inside with an expression that was not quite pleased but was adjacent to it. She sat down on a stump Maeve used as a second chair and laid a folder of papers on the workbench. There had been a complication, she said, with Gertrude Colquhoun's claim to the Oak property. It had come from an unexpected direction. The solicitor Roland Fitch, in the course of settling another estate for another client, had been required to produce his records from the Oak case for a routine audit by the Territorial Law Society. The records had been reviewed. A second set of figures had been found. A draft of Gertrude's ledger, in Fitch's own handwriting, dated 3 weeks before the official ledger, had supposedly been produced by Gertrude from her personal records. The dates did not align. The figures had been constructed, not discovered. Fitch, faced with a professional conduct review and the prospect of losing his license, had provided a full statement. The fabricated debt was documented. The ledger was fraudulent. Gertrude Colquhoun had conspired with Roland Fitch to manufacture evidence in order to deprive Maeve of property she had been legally bequeathed. There would be a hearing, Evangeline said. The territorial court would be reviewing the original transfer of the Oak property on the River Road. Maeve would be required to testify. She asked Maeve directly, "Are you willing to do that?" Maeve set down her draw knife. She thought of Roland Fitch and his apologetic eyes that never quite met hers. She thought of the 30 days' notice, delivered in the tone of someone reading a weather report. She thought of her stepsister's laughter, and the slammed door, and the $40. And then she thought of Sylvia Oak, who had taught her that the grain of a thing always tells you the truth, if you're patient enough to follow it. Yes, she said. She was willing. The hearing was held in Lachlan in January, in a courtroom that was cold enough that the lawyers kept their coats on. Maeve sat in the witness box for 2 hours. She answered every question plainly, and without flourish, the way she did everything, fully, without waste. She produced Sylvia's biscuit tin, and the real records inside it. She produced the draft ledger that had been found in Fitch's files, which Evangeline had obtained through the Law Society proceedings. She described, without anger in her voice, the sequence of events from the delivery of the first document to the morning she had walked out of the shop with her tools wrapped in wool cloth. Gertrude's barrister tried, as barristers do, to suggest that Maeve was bitter, was motivated by resentment, was a young woman of no property and no standing trying to take what was not hers. Maeve looked at him steadily and said that she had simply told the court what had happened, and that the documents would tell the rest. The documents did. The ruling came 6 weeks later, in a letter delivered to the mill by the Lachlan postal rider. Evangeline Ross came with him, which told Maeve before she opened the envelope that the news was good. The original transfer of the Oak property was voided. The deed to the River Road workshop and the adjoining woodlot was restored to Maeve Colquhoun as the named beneficiary of Sylvia Oakey's will. Roland Fitch was disbarred. Gertrude Colquhoun was ordered to pay restitution of costs to the court and to Maeve directly, a figure that, while not large, was more money than Maeve had seen at one time in her life. She sat on the stump by her workbench for a while after Evangeline left. The mill was quiet around her. Outside, the river was still frozen, but there was a softness in the light that February sometimes brings in the valley, a suggestion that the season is thinking of turning. She held the letter in her lap and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, or perhaps had never quite felt before. Not relief, exactly, and not triumph. Something steadier than either. The sense of a thing having been put right, as close to right as things in this world tend to get. She went back to the River Road in March. The shop was exactly as she had left it, which is to say it had been neglected for 4 months by people who did not care for it. She cleaned it out, with the same methodical thoroughness she had applied to everything else, sweeping the shavings, oiling the bench, checking the joints on the tool racks. She found a tool she had not noticed was missing until she saw it again. A small folding rule of Sylvia's, brass and boxwood, that had been left on the window ledge. She picked it up and put it in her pocket. She built a proper sign for the door, carved from a piece of the white oak she had brought from the mill in 2 trips on Crispin Forel's borrowed wagon. She used a V-tool for the letters, cutting each one with the care Sylvia had taught her to give to everything that was meant to last. The carving took 2 days, and she was satisfied with it in the way she was satisfied with any piece of work that had been done right. Quietly, without needing to say so to anyone, she hung the sign on the 1st of April, in weather that could not quite decide between winter and spring. The kind of morning that is very Canadian in its ambivalence, gray and cold, and occasionally very beautiful. She stood back and looked at it for a moment and thought of Sylvia, who had stood in a doorway much like this one 20 years earlier and made a different life out of what remained to her. And she thought that this was the thing worth keeping. Not the property, not the tools, not even the skills, though all of those mattered. What was worth keeping was the knowledge of how to begin again, how to read what was actually there rather than what you had expected to find, how to work with the grain of things. People in Heron Crossing stopped calling her the Colquhoun girl. They called her Maeve the woodworker, or sometimes just Maeve at the shop, the way you name a place that has become part of how you navigate the world. She was 22 years old. She had been left with $40 and a draw knife and a slammed door. She had built something from it that was hers, made the way Sylvia had taught her everything should be made. Not quickly, not easily, but true. We hope this story stayed with you tonight. If you know someone who could use a reminder that what we're left with is never quite as little as it seems, we'd be glad if you shared it with them. And we'd love to hear from you. Settle in and leave a comment below. What is something you once thought was worthless that turned out to be worth everything?